Lionel sold more toy trains than any company on Earth, and then the country stopped buying them. By the mid-1950s, the factory was pushing millions of sets a year. The catalogue landed in American homes every autumn. Department stores ran Lionel layouts in their front windows during the holiday season, drawing sidewalk crowds 3 deep. A boy who did not own a set knew boys who did. A father who bought one was not just buying a toy. He was buying a reason to kneel on the living room floor beside his son and build something together without either of them having to say what it meant. Then the factory closed. The name was sold, and sold again. The trains went to the attic. What did them in was not a better train. It was television, slot cars, the space race, and a quiet collapse in the thing Lionel was actually selling, which was never the locomotive. It was fatherhood itself. The product they launched in desperation had nothing to do with railroading. And today, a single post-war locomotive in its original box can sell for more than Cowan charged for 100 of them. This is what happened to Lionel trains, the toy every American dad bought, and the ritual the country quietly left behind. Joshua Lionel Cowan did not set out to build toy trains. At the turn of the 20th century, he was a young inventor in New York City, restless and commercially sharp, moving from one electrical novelty to the next. He tinkered with battery tubes, flash lamp detonators, electric doorbells. He had a genuine talent for engineering, and an even greater talent for reading what ordinary people would pay money for. The train happened almost by accident. Cowan designed a small electric locomotive to run on a loop of track inside a store window. The purpose was advertising. A moving train would catch the eye of pedestrians passing on the sidewalk, and while they stood watching, they would notice whatever the store was actually selling: shoes, dry goods, hardware. The locomotive was a prop. But the customers did not ask about the merchandise. They asked about the train. They wanted to know where they could buy one. Store owners started calling Cowan back, not to reorder display items, but to reorder the locomotive and the track. The thing he had built to sell other products was the only product anyone wanted. Cowan was smart enough to listen. He incorporated the Lionel Manufacturing Company and redirected his entire operation toward producing electric trains for consumers. His timing was impeccable. Electricity was spreading through American homes at a pace that made everything electric feel like the future. A toy that ran on household current, humming and clicking around a metal track under its own power, was not just entertaining. It was modern. It was progress, miniaturized, and placed on the living room floor. The early models were crude by later standards. Heavy tin shells riding simple motors, running on wide-gauge track that swallowed most of a tabletop. But they moved. In an era when most children's toys were carved wood, stamped tin, and stuffed cloth, a self-propelled electric locomotive was something close to miraculous. Cowan understood that the magic was not in the object. It was in the motion. A train that sits still is a decoration. A train that moves is alive. He also understood something subtler about who was really buying his product. The trains were marketed to children, but the person who walked into the store and handed over the money was the father. And the father was not buying the train for the child alone. He was buying it for himself, for the pleasure of assembling something mechanical, of controlling something electrical, of sharing a fascination with a son who was young enough to be fascinated alongside him. Cowan sold to the boy in the catalogue and to the man at the register, and he made sure both of them got what they came for. Cowan made one decision early in the company's history that would define Lionel for the next half-century. He settled on O gauge as his standard track size, a width of roughly 1¼ inches between the rails. It was not the smallest gauge on the market, and it was not the largest. It sat in a middle ground that balanced two competing demands: detail and affordability. O-gauge trains were large enough to carry realistic proportions, working headlights and moving parts. They were small enough to fit on a table or a sheet of plywood propped on sawhorses in a basement corner. The genius of the gauge choice was not aesthetic, it was economic. A family that bought its first Lionel O-gauge starter set bought into an ecosystem. Every additional purchase had to be O-gauge. Every boxcar, every signal tower, every switch, every curved section of track. Christmas after Christmas, birthday after birthday, the layout grew, and every new piece cemented the family deeper into Lionel's world. The cost of switching to a competitor was total. A father who had spent years building an O-gauge layout was not going to tear it down and start over with different track. Cowan grasped the logic of customer lock-in on pure instinct, decades before anyone in a business school would give the concept a formal name. The product line expanded year after year. Lionel's factory produced steam locomotives, diesel replicas, freight cars, passenger coaches, operating accessories, transformer boxes, and switches. Each season brought visible refinements: die-cast metal shells replacing tin, more realistic paint schemes, smoke generators that puffed real vapor from the locomotive stack, electromagnetic couplers that released with the press of a button, whistles that blew on command from the transformer. The trains were not true-scale models. They were slightly oversized, slightly simplified, built to survive a 9-year-old's hands while still looking good enough to impress his father. That deliberate middle ground between toy and model was Cowan's particular genius, and no competitor ever found it as precisely as he did. If the trains were the product, the catalogue was the engine that sold them. Every autumn, Lionel published a full-color catalogue and distributed it through dealers and direct mail to homes across the country. For millions of American boys between the 1930s and the early 1960s, the Lionel catalogue was the single most anticipated piece of mail that came through the front door all year. It landed on the mat like a contract with the future. The catalogues were masterworks of aspiration. They showed complete model railroad layouts that no ordinary household could build or afford. Sweeping landscapes with papier-mâché mountains, operating coal loaders, miniature towns with illuminated storefronts, multiple trains running simultaneously on interlocking main lines controlled from a single console. A boy would sit cross-legged on the floor with the catalogue open across his knees and circle items with a pencil, understanding at some instinctive level that he would receive one or two of them at most. The distance between what the catalogue presented and what the family could buy was not a flaw in the marketing. It was the business model. Lionel sold a world that took years to build, one accessory and one Christmas at a time. The language reinforced the vision. Lionel did not describe its products as toys. The catalogue talked about operating the trains, not playing with them. Accessories carried names borrowed from real railroading: automatic gateman, barrel loader, log dump car, magnetic crane, coal elevator. A child who assembled a Lionel layout was not pretending. He was running a railroad. He was an engineer, a dispatcher, a yardmaster. The catalogue gave him the vocabulary, and Lionel sold him the infrastructure to match, one box at a time. No competitor came close to this. American Flyer published its own catalogue. Marx had its own marketing operation, but neither company understood the long game with the clarity that Cowan did. The Lionel catalogue did not just sell trains, it sold a relationship with a brand that was designed to last a lifetime, and for many families, it did. Years later, grown men who had not touched a train in decades could describe specific pages from the Lionel catalogues of their childhood. The operating milk car that ejected tiny cans onto a platform, the coal loader with the vibrating chute, the rotating beacon that swept a beam across the layout like a lighthouse. These were not just products in a brochure, they were promises. And a boy who circled one with a pencil in October carried that promise in his head until Christmas morning, when he would find out whether his parents had read the circles. Here is the thing about Lionel that none of the corporate owners who later bought and sold the company ever fully understood. Lionel was not in the toy business. It was not even in the model railroad business. It was in the fatherhood business. The train set under the Christmas tree was never primarily about the train. It was about the man who bought it and the boy who received it, and the hours they would spend together in a basement or a spare room, wiring switches and debating where the siding should go. The locomotive was a pretext. The real product was time spent side by side, structured around a shared project that neither father nor son ever had to name for what it actually was. In mid-century America, where men were expected to provide and protect, but not necessarily to express affection in words. The train layout was an acceptable arena for closeness. You did not have to say anything tender. You just had to hand your son the right screwdriver and nod when he placed the boxcar on the track himself for the first time. This is why the later decline was never really about slot cars, or rockets, or television. Those were triggers. The deeper shift was in the architecture of American family life itself, in how fathers and sons spent their time, in what counted as togetherness and what did not. When that changed, when Saturday afternoons moved from the basement to the soccer field and eventually to separate screens in separate rooms, no marketing campaign and no product redesign could have rescued what Lionel was actually selling. Because what Lionel was selling was not a thing you could redesign. It was a way of being together that the culture was quietly leaving behind. The men who ran Lionel after Cowan never grasped this. They looked at the sales figures and saw a product losing market share. They commissioned reports and held meetings and reorganized divisions. What they never asked, because it was not the kind of question that appears on a spreadsheet, was whether the country still had room for the thing that made their product matter. The years after the Second World War were the best Lionel would ever know. Millions of young veterans came home, married, bought houses in new suburban developments with unfinished basements and empty living rooms, and started families at a pace the country had never experienced. They needed things to fill those houses and activities to share with the sons who arrived in rapid succession. The Lionel train set answered both needs at once. Lionel's post-war revenue climbed sharply and stayed high through the first half of the 1950s. Department stores devoted entire floor sections to Lionel displays during the holiday season. Operating layouts ran all day in storefront windows, drawing sidewalk crowds 3 and 4 deep. The company saturated every available advertising channel: magazine spreads in Life and the Saturday Evening Post, television spots during prime time, in-store demonstrations where a salesman in a white shirt ran trains while a circle of boys pressed against the counter. The brand achieved a cultural penetration that went far beyond market share. A boy who did not own a Lionel set knew boys who did. The layout was a social magnet, the mid-century equivalent of the game console decades later. Friends came over to watch the trains run, to take turns at the transformer throttle, to see whatever new piece had arrived under the tree that year. The economics were elegant. The starter set, a locomotive, 3 or 4 cars, an oval of track, and a transformer, was priced to be reachable for a middle-class household. Everything after that was pure margin. The extra rolling stock, the additional track sections, the operating accessories, the upgrade to a more powerful transformer. These purchases stretched across years and generated profits that the starter set alone could never match. Cowan had built a business that fed on its own momentum. Each year the layout expanded. Each year the family's investment deepened, and each year it became harder to imagine the holiday season without the trains circling beneath the tree. American Flyer, Lionel's closest competitor, offered S-gauge trains with 2 rail track that looked more prototypical and ran on alternating current with realistic forward, neutral, reverse sequencing. Flyer had loyal customers and a product that serious modelers respected. Marx produced cheaper sets in enormous volume through discount chains, putting a train set within reach of families who could never afford a Lionel. Both companies had their strengths. Neither came close to unseating Lionel from the center of the American Christmas. American Flyer was the purist's choice. Marx was the budget alternative. Lionel was the default. And in consumer markets, the default almost always wins. The decline did not arrive like a derailment. It arrived like a slow downgrade, barely perceptible at first, steepening only when it was too late to brake. Television was the first force. Through the late 1950s, the television set replaced the train layout as the focal point of the American home. A boy who had once spent Saturday afternoons on the floor running freight cars around a mountain could now sit in the living room watching westerns and serials. Television required nothing of its audience but passive attention. The train set required imagination, patience, and the willingness to build something with your hands before anything happened. In the daily competition for a child's hours, the easier option nearly always won. The living room screen glowed, and the basement lights stayed off. The trains sat on their track in the dark, waiting for a boy who was not coming back downstairs. Slot cars struck next, and they struck at Lionel's core. The rise of slot car racing in the early 1960s delivered precisely the father-son dynamic that had powered Lionel's business for decades, but faster, louder, and competitive in a way that trains never were. 2 cars, 2 controllers, side by side, racing for the win. The satisfaction was immediate and visceral. A race lasted minutes, not months. You did not need a plywood table or a weekend of wiring. You plugged in the track, dropped the cars in the slots, and raced. Compared to a Lionel freight train circling a layout at a dignified scale speed, the slot car was caffeine. The space race delivered the cultural blow that reframed everything. After the orbital flights of the early 1960s, the national imagination launched upward. The future was not on the rails. The future was above the atmosphere. Toy rockets, astronaut helmets, and space capsule kits displaced trains on department store shelves and in the wish lists circled in catalogues. Steam locomotives, even miniature electric versions of them, carried the scent of yesterday. A boy who dreamed of walking on the moon did not dream of dispatching a freight consist through a mountain tunnel. Lionel's revenue flattened in the late 1950s and began a sustained decline through the early 1960s. Each Christmas brought slightly fewer orders. Each catalogue generated slightly less urgency at the dealer counter. The company was not collapsing in any dramatic sense. It was deflating, the way a tire deflates around a slow nail, losing pressure so gradually that by the time anyone checked the gauge, the rim was already scraping asphalt. Lionel's response to the slide was to chase the very trends that were stealing its customers. The company produced science kits. It launched a line of slot car sets of its own. It experimented with fishing equipment and other consumer goods that had nothing to do with model railroading, grasping for revenue in categories where it carried no expertise, no reputation, and no competitive advantage. The results were predictable. The science kits were forgettable. The slot cars were competent, but entered a crowded field already dominated by brands that had arrived earlier and built dedicated followings. The fishing tackle was a bewildering detour that confused customers and retailers in equal measure. None of these products sold well enough to replace the declining train revenue, and every dollar and every hour of management attention spent developing them was a dollar and an hour not spent on the product that still defined the company in the mind of every American who had ever owned one. Meanwhile, the core trains were getting worse. In the push to hold margins as volume dropped, management began substituting cheaper materials. Plastic shells replaced die-cast metal bodies. Detail work that had once been individually applied was simplified or dropped entirely. Transformers grew lighter. Track sections became thinner. The smoke units still puffed, but the vapor was thinner and the mechanism less reliable. The couplers still connected, but without the solid, satisfying snap that a returning customer remembered from a decade earlier. Any man who had grown up with the older product could feel the difference the moment he lifted a new locomotive from the box. It was lighter in the hand. It felt temporary in a way that the old trains never had. The downward spiral was relentless. Fewer sales forced deeper cost cuts, which produced visibly inferior trains, which drove away the loyal customers who might have sustained the business through a difficult stretch. The men who had bought Lionel for decades did not leave for a competitor because no competitor offered what Lionel had offered at its peak. They simply stopped buying trains. The layout went to the attic. A sheet went over it. Nobody threw it out because you do not throw out your Lionel. But the transformer stayed unplugged, and the track gathered a fine layer of dust, and each year the sheet settled a little lower over the mountains and the stations and the silent rolling stock. Cowan sold his controlling interest in Lionel in 1959 to a group that included the attorney Roy Cohn. He was in his early 80s, his energy was fading, and the business he had built was no longer the business he recognized. Letting go of the trains could not have been simple for a man who had spent more than half a century building them, but the alternative was watching them corrode under his own name. Cowan died in 1965, 6 years after handing over the company. He had lived long enough to watch strangers begin dismantling what he built, but not long enough to see how far the unraveling would go. What followed was a pattern that would repeat with numbing regularity for 3 decades. Lionel passed from one corporate owner to the next, each arriving with a strategy, each failing to execute it, each eventually selling to the following buyer at a loss or under duress. The details changed with each transaction, but the underlying dynamics stayed constant. An outside entity acquired the Lionel brand, believing the name itself was the primary asset, only to discover that a brand disconnected from the culture and the craftsmanship that had created it was worth considerably less than the purchase price suggested. Manufacturing left the original factory. Production moved domestically at first, then eventually overseas. The trains that had once carried domestic origin markings stamped proudly on their undersides came back from new plants with new markings and new quality profiles. For the customer base that Lionel depended on, men who held craftsmanship and domestic manufacturing as matters of deep personal identity, the shift was not a footnote on a product label. It registered as a verdict on what the company now valued, which was unit cost, and what it no longer valued, which was the trust of the men who had bought its trains for a lifetime. At one point during the ownership carousel, the rights to manufacture Lionel trains and the rights to the Lionel name belonged to entirely separate entities. Cowan would have found this incomprehensible. For him, the train and the name were the same thing, fused together by decades of shared identity. You could no more split them than you could uncouple a locomotive from its tender and expect either half to function. But corporate restructuring does not run on the same logic as a rail yard. The split happened. The trains kept rolling off new assembly lines. The name kept changing hands, and each transaction widened the gap between what Lionel had become and what it had once meant. Here is the irony that Cowan, who always had a showman's instinct for a good twist, would have appreciated. As the company faded, the product became more valuable than it had ever been during the Golden Age. Vintage Lionel trains are now serious collectibles. Post-war locomotives in original condition, particularly limited production runs and uncommon color variations, routinely sell for hundreds of dollars at auction and through specialty dealers. Exceptional pieces push well into the thousands. Train shows and swap meets draw collectors by the thousands to convention halls across the country, where men in their 60s and 70s examine pre-war standard gauge pieces with the concentration of gem dealers and negotiate prices with a tenacity that would have impressed Cowan himself. The collector market accomplished something that none of the corporate owners ever managed. It preserved the meaning of the Lionel name by preserving the objects that had earned it. A Lionel locomotive from 1948 that still runs, still sends a curl of vapor from its stack, still sounds its whistle when the button on the transformer is pressed, is no longer a toy. It is an artifact of a specific American moment. A young veteran kneeling beside a Christmas tree with his son. Both of them watching a small metal train circle the track. Both of them sure of the solidity of the world they were building together. Lionel still exists as a company today. It produces trains aimed primarily at adult hobbyists and dedicated collectors, a market far smaller than the mass Christmas business Cowan built, but stable enough to sustain ongoing operations. The current product line is technically superior to anything from the post-war era. Digital soundboards reproduce prototype engine notes with startling fidelity. Wireless control systems have replaced the old transformer dial. Paint finishes replicate decades of service weathering with accuracy that the Golden Age models never attempted. The engineering is genuinely impressive. But the modern trains are not what Lionel was. They are a product for enthusiasts who already know what they want. The old trains were a ritual for families who were discovering something together. The distance between those two things is the distance between a hobby and a bond. Nobody buys a modern Lionel locomotive to place beneath a Christmas tree and kneel beside on a cold Saturday morning with a child who has never seen one run. The ritual broke somewhere in the 1960s, and no amount of digital sound or wireless control has found a way to mend it. The object endures. What it meant is harder to find. The trains outlasted everything. They outlasted the company that built them, the factories that stamped them, the catalogs that sold them, and the man who dreamed them into existence in a New York workshop more than a century ago. Somewhere tonight, in a basement or an attic or a storage unit that has not been opened in years, a Lionel locomotive rests in its original box, tissue paper still folded around the shell. The transformer still works. The track still connects. The O-gauge rails are the same width they have always been, the same width Cowan chose before most of the country had electricity in the walls. All it needs is someone willing to kneel down and plug it in.